The Crisis of 1931. It was this shrinking of values which carried the economic crisis into the stage of financial and banking crisis, and beyond these to the stage of political crisis. As values declined, production fell rapidly. Banks found it increasingly difficult to meet the demands upon their reserves. These demands increased with a decline in confidence. Governments found that their tax receipts fell so rapidly that budgets became unbalanced, in spite of every effort to prevent it. The financial and banking crisis began in Central Europe, early in 1931, reached London by the end of that year, spread to the United States and France in 1932, bringing the United States to the acute stage in 1933, and France in 1934. The acute stage began early in 1931 in Central Europe, where the deflationary crisis was producing drastic results. Unable to balance its budget or obtain adequate foreign loans, Germany was unable to meet her reparation obligations. At this critical moment, as we have seen, the largest bank in Austria collapsed because of its inability to liquidate its assets at sufficiently high prices and with enough speed to meet the claims being presented to it. The Austrian debacle soon spread the banking panic to Germany. The Hoover moratorium on reparations relieved the pressure on Germany in the middle of 1931, but not enough to permit any real financial recovery. Millions of short-term credits lent from London were tied up in frozen accounts in Germany. As a result, in the summer of 1931, the uneasiness spread to London. The pound sterling was very vulnerable. There were 5 principal reasons. 1. The pound was overvalued. 2. Costs of production in Britain were much more rigid than prices. 3. Gold reserves were precariously small. 4. The burden of public debt was too great in a deflationary atmosphere. 5. There were greater liabilities than assets in short-term international holdings in London, about £407 million sterling to £153 million sterling. This last fact was revealed by the publication of the Macmillan Report in June 1931, right at the middle of the crisis in Central Europe, where most of the short-term assets were frozen. The bank rate was raised from 2.5% to 4.5% to encourage capital to stay in Britain. £130 million sterling in credits was obtained from France and the United States in July and August to fight the depreciation of the pound by throwing more dollars and francs into the market. To restore confidence among the wealthy, who were causing the panic, an effort was made to balance the budget by cutting public expenditures drastically. This, by reducing purchasing power, had injurious effects on business activity and increased unrest among the masses of the people. Mutiny broke out in the British fleet in protest against pay cuts. Various physical and extra-legal restrictions were placed on export of gold, such as issuing gold bars of a low purity unacceptable to the Bank of France. The outflow of gold could not be stopped. It amounted to £200 million sterling in 2 months. On September 18th, New York and Paris refused further credits to the British Treasury, and 3 days later the gold standard was suspended. The bank rate still stood at 4.5%. To many experts, the most significant aspect of the event was not that Britain went off gold, but that she did so with the bank rate at 4.5%. It had always been said in Britain that a 10% bank rate would pull gold out of the earth. By 1931, the authorities in Britain saw clearly the futility of trying to stay on gold by raising the bank rate. This indicates how conditions had changed. It was realized that the movement of gold was subject to factors which the authorities could not control more than it was under the influence of factors they could control. It also shows, a hopeful sign, that the authorities, after 12 years, were beginning to realize that conditions had changed. For the first time, people began to realize that the two problems, domestic prosperity and stable exchanges, were quite separate problems, and that the old orthodox practice of sacrificing the former to the latter must end. From this point on, one country after another began to seek domestic prosperity by managed prices and stable exchanges by exchange control. That is, the link between the two the gold standard was broken, and one problem was made into two. The British suspension of gold was by necessity, not by choice. It was regarded as an evil, but it was really a blessing. As a result of this mistake, many of the benefits which could have been derived from it were lost by trying to counterbalance the inflationary results of the suspension by other deflationary actions. The discount rate was raised to 6%. Valiant efforts to balance the budget continued. A protective tariff was established and a program of fairly stiff taxes installed. As a result, prices did not rise enough to give that spur to production which would have been necessary to increase prosperity and reduce unemployment. No system of exchange control was set up. As a result, the depreciation of sterling in respect to gold standard currencies could not be prevented and amounted to 30% by December 1931. Such a depreciation was regarded by the authorities as an evil, chiefly because of orthodox economic theories, which considered parity of exchanges as an end in itself, and partly because of the need to pay the £130 million sterling in Franco-American credits, a burden which increased as sterling depreciated in respect to the dollars and francs. As a result of the British abandonment of the gold standard, the central core of the world's financial system was disrupted. This core, which in 1914 was exclusively in London, in 1931 was divided among London, New York, and Paris. London's share depended on financial skill in old habits. New York's share depended on her position as the world's great creditor. Paris's share depended on a combination of a creditor position with an undervalued currency which attracted gold. From 1927 to 1931, these three had controlled the world's financial system, with payments flowing into the three, credits flowing out, and stable exchanges between them. The events of September 1931 broke up this triangle. Stable exchanges continued for dollar-franc, leaving dollar-pound and pound-franc to fluctuate. This did not permit an adjustment of the maladjusted exchange rates of 1928 to 1931. Concretely, the undervaluation of the franc in 1928 and the overvaluation of the pound in 1925 could not be remedied by the events of 1931. A sterling franc rate, which would have eliminated the undervaluation of the franc, would have resulted in a sterling dollar rate, which would have overcorrected the overvaluation of sterling. On the other hand, the depreciation of the pound put great pressure on both the dollar and the franc. At the same time, Britain sought to exploit as much as possible her economic relations with her home market, the Empire, and that group of other countries known as the Sterling Bloc. The home market was set aside by the establishment of customs duties on imports into the United Kingdom, special customs duties November 1931, and a general tariff in February 1932. The empire was brought into closer economic ties by a group of 11 imperial preference treaties made at Ottawa in August 1932. The Sterling Bloc was reinforced and enlarged by a series of bilateral trade agreements with various countries, beginning with Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Argentina. Thus, the world tended to divide into two financial groups, the Sterling Bloc, organized about Britain, and the Gold Bloc, organized about the United States, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. The depreciation of sterling in relation to gold made the currencies of the Gold Bloc overvalued and relieved Britain of that burdensome status for the first time since 1925. As a result, Britain found it easier to export and more difficult to import, and obtained a favorable balance of trade for the first time in almost 7 years. On the other hand, the gold countries found their depressions intensified. As a third result of the British abandonment of the gold standard, Britain freed herself from her financial subjugation to France. This subjection had resulted from the vulnerable position of the British gold reserves in contrast to the bulging appearance of the French reserves. After 1931, the financial positions of the two countries were reversed. When Britain was able to add a financial superiority after 1931, to the political superiority she had possessed since 1924, Since 1924, it became possible for Britain to force France to accept the policy of appeasement. Moreover, the financial crisis of 1931 was to bring to power in Britain the national government, which was to carry out the policy of appeasement. As a fourth result, the countries still on gold began to adopt new trade barriers, such as tariffs and quotas, to prevent Britain from using the advantage of depreciated currency to increase her exports to them. The countries already off gold began to see the value in currency depreciation, and the possibility of races in depreciation began to form in the minds of some. As a fifth result of the abandonment of gold, it became possible to rearm without the resulting imbalance of the budget, leading to financial jeopardy as under a gold standard. Little advantage was taken of this, because pacifism of the left and appeasement of the right were regarded as substitutes for arms. Because of the deflationary policy which accompanied the abandonment of gold in Great Britain, recovery from depression did not result except to a very slight degree. Neither prices nor employment rose until 1933, and from that year on, the improvement was slow. The depreciation of sterling did not result in an improvement in the foreign trade balance, exports rising very slightly and imports falling 12% in 1932 in comparison with 1931. This led to a revival of confidence in sterling and a simultaneous decline in confidence in the gold standard currencies. Foreign funds began to flow to London. The flow of capital into Britain early in 1932 resulted in an appreciation of sterling in respect to the gold currencies. This was unwelcome to the British government, since it would destroy her newly acquired trade advantage. The pound sterling appreciated in respect to the dollar from 3.27 on December 1, 1931, to 3.80 on March 31, 1932. To control this, the government, in May 1932, set up the Exchange Equalization Account with capital of £175 million sterling. This fund was to be used to stabilize the exchange rates by buying and selling foreign exchange against the trend of the market. In this way, the old automatic regulation by the market of the internal credit structure through the international flow of funds was broken. Control of the credit structure was left to the Bank of England, while control of the exchanges went to the Exchange Equalization Fund. This made it possible for Britain to adopt a policy of easy and plentiful credit within the country without being deterred by a flight of capital from the country. Since the Exchange Equalization Fund was not a system of exchange control, but merely a government management of the regular exchange market, it was not in a position to handle any very considerable immigration of capital. The easy credit policies of Britain, designed to encourage business activity, had thus to be combined with deflationary prices, designed to prevent any powerful flight of capital. The bank rate was dropped to 2% by July 1932, and an embargo was placed on new foreign capital issues to keep this easy money at home. The chief exceptions to this embargo arose from loans to be used in the general policy of binding the sterling bloc to Britain, and the proceeds of these had to be used in Britain. On this basis, although sterling fell to 3.14 by the end of November 1932, a mild economic revival was built up. Cheap credit permitted a shift of economic activity from the old lines, like coal, steel, textiles, to new lines, like chemicals, motors, electrical products. The tariff permitted a rapid growth of cartels and monopolies, whose process of creation provided at least a temporary revival of economic activity. The continued low food prices permitted the income from this increase in activity to be diverted to necessities of a different kind, especially dwelling construction. The budget was balanced, and early in 1934 showed a surplus of £30 million sterling. The improvement in Britain was not shared by the countries still on gold. As a result of the competition of depreciated sterling, they found their balances of trade pushed toward the unfavorable side of their deflation, and prices increased. Tariffs had to be raised, quotas and exchange controls set up. The United States could hardly do the first of these. Her tariff of 1930 was already the highest in history, and rejected the others in principle.